Good day, and thank you for listening to the We Are Here podcast. I'm Teddy Manywounds. Today we are joined in conversation with Muriel Manywounds. Muriel is a citizen of the Tsuut'ina Nation and one of our senior elders. She's currently in her 90s, but I won't tell you her exact age. Muriel grew up on the Saddle Lake Reservation in northern Alberta, which is where she also survived attending residential school. As a young woman, she pursued a career in teaching, first attending the University of Alberta. Upon completion of her studies, Muriel moved to Tsuut'ina Nation, where she began a professional teaching career. She also became a citizen of Tsuut'ina Nation by becoming a part of the Manywounds family and subsequently starting a family of her own. While raising 4 young children, she decided to go back to university, obtaining another degree from the University of Calgary. Muriel also happens to be my grandmother, and I am so excited and happy to share this conversation with all of you. We conducted this interview in her main living room, at her dining room table on a beautiful summer day. You will hear background noise and one text message notification, which happened to be from my father, her youngest son. During a portion of our interview, Muriel and I talk about the use and the intent of language, specifically the English language, as it pertains to First Nations legislation. In Bill C-92, which is an act according to the Government of Canada, respecting First Nations, Inuit, Métis children, youth and families, an act to affirm and recognize our jurisdiction over the Child and Family Services. In the act, it states, "In the best interest of the child." This language is left much too open to interpretation, according to Grandma Muriel. In the past, our First Nations' best interests were interpreted by those who governed us. Using residential schools as an example, our best interests are not always taken into full account when decisions are being made on our behalf. Muriel believes that the wording should be changed to love and respect for the child. So we always need to be mindful of the language we're using and how we're using it. Please join me in a conversation with Grandma Muriel. Good morning. My name is Teddy Manywounds with the LPTS department, and I have the pleasure of sitting here with my grandmother, Muriel Manywounds, who has agreed to talk with me today about our Constitution and draft, and about why that is so important to us as Tsuut'ina Nation individuals, and why that document, I believe, needs all of our attention and all of our involvement with its current development. Good morning.
Good morning.
So what I really wanted to ask you, Grandma, is could you explain to me, first off, what is a constitution and why is that so important to us?
All right. My understanding of a constitution is that it is the rules that a group of people agree to live by. That's a constitution. We haven't written down at Tsuut'ina our rules yet. Our constitution as a written document is still in the making. But that doesn't mean that the people who are Tsuut'ina now and were for thousands of years didn't have rules that they lived by in their own group. So we need to look at some of those old rules when we're writing a constitution. But because the world as it is all around us now, we also have to be sure that we take what we're living with right now into consideration when we're writing our constitution. Now, I wish I had you in front of me, and then I could say to you, so what do you think would be important to put in a constitution? But since you're not here, I'll answer it.
And please, I think one of the bigger, in my engagement with the Constitution, I think constitutions and legislation, and I've talked about this with everyone in the department, it can be intimidating, and it can be a document that when the language is a barrier and people don't understand, they often, I find, don't know or don't feel they know how to ask a question in regards to constitution. And for all of our listeners, I know that Grandma Muriel would love to have you all here so she can tell you. But since you're not here, why don't I'm going to let her do the talking and maybe guide all of you to answer some of the questions that you're maybe scared to ask or you don't know how to.
Okay. So one of the things we might want to make clear in our Constitution is who are these Tsuut'ina people that we're writing a Constitution for? Well, aha, we have it. We don't have to write it over again. I can't show you, but I'm holding it up. We have our citizenship code, and that very clearly tells us who can be a Tsuut'ina Nation citizen. So in our Constitution, we might mention our citizenship code, but we don't have to write it all over again. It's already there. Now, another question we might ask is, where do these Tsuut'ina people live? What's their land base? Where do they put their homes? We all know now what actual land base Tsuut'ina has. But in the long ago days, before colonists came to this part of the country, Tsuut'ina people didn't just say, well, this square area, that's where we live. They used a lot of the land, what now is called traditional land for Tsuut'ina. But now we have a very laid out piece of land that is our land base. And we got that when Treaty 7 was signed. Well, we didn't actually get this. I imagine most of you know the story. A bullhead working hard to get this particular place that we live, because when Treaty 7 was signed, Tsuut'ina got assigned part of the prairie down by Standoff. Ouch! That's fine for the people who lived there. They were prairie people, but Tsuut'ina people weren't. So Bullhead had a long, many years fight to get us back here. So we know our land base because it was laid out in actually 1984, or not 1884, when Bullhead made the deal to come back here where Tsuut'ina is now. Treaty 7, but I couldn't find one this morning. So it's not very long. And our students in school from the time they're in junior high should be learning what's in Treaty 7. It's the most important document we have to live by, without a doubt. Treaty number 7. Well, then we might say, all right, we have this piece of land we call home, that's Tsuut'ina. Who can live here? That's another question we might put in the Constitution, or we might answer in it. Who can live at Tsuut'ina? Who makes the rules about who can live here? Maybe we better put that in the Constitution. But wait a minute. We don't really have to, because we already have our residency bylaw, and that tells us who may or may not live at Tsuut'ina. We might mention it in the Constitution, but we don't have to write it all down over again. Now, at the very beginning of our citizenship code,
what you all can't see is Grandma Muriel sitting here in front of me. As I have been able to research, is she keeps all the papers in her own personal library, and so I mean, not for nothing. We don't have bookshelves and bookshelves, but we do have. I mean, your mind as a librarian itself, and so thank you for lending me that, but also just being very aware and very versed in all of the documents in legislation and otherwise that pertain to our Constitution and pertain to the development of Tsuut'ina Nation. Just to give you all some context, in case you hear some papers rattling, Grandma always comes prepared, and I will let her continue on.
I was just going to say, at the very beginning of our Citizenship Code is this short sentence: we, and that means Tsuut'ina, intend that the collective rights of Tsuut'ina supersede individual rights. And supersede means come before. So our collective rights are the most important. Not that individual rights aren't also important, but the collective rights come first. That's not what most of the Canadian government thinks. They have their Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and they expect us to live by it. But that's not the way the Tsuut'ina Society, and I would say all First Nations societies in this land, were originally before colonists came here. So we always need to keep reminding the governments that try to push us around that collective rights for us are the most important.
I think that's really important to note, is that collective rights aspect of our Constitution. I know for myself, living in New York City and just not being here, you're very much taught, especially in America, like your individual rights, and you have this and you work towards this. You. I come home and often back on the nation, this is, I think, where there's confusion with people who are not Indigenous and not First Nation, and they wouldn't know and they wouldn't see that as a nation and as nations, we've always looked out for, and this goes back to the traditional governing bodies that we used to have before colonization happened. And it wasn't written down the way we're writing it down. I think that's a really hard thing for all of us to sit down and grasp and do, because it's not traditionally, as I've been researching, something we've done. Like, we come from very oral teachings and oral traditions. What we're doing today and what we're doing with this project, lending our voices to learning. Do you think that we're doing ourselves a favor in putting things down on paper? And what should we be careful of, maybe, with doing that? And that we don't want to ever also put ourselves into a situation where we're putting something down and then later we say, oops. So what do you think are the safeguards in us putting this knowledge onto paper so that we can create a constitution?
Well, somehow, just like we did in the Citizenship Code, we need to get this idea of collective rights front and center for young people. Maybe most First Nations are losing that now. Tsuut'ina's beginning to. We've had some examples. And a blatant example off the reserve of putting individual rights first is those people who didn't want to wear masks in the pandemic, who don't want to get vaccinated. Silly people. If they put the whole group ahead of themselves, they'd do what was good for the whole group. But there are some people out there, because they have this individual Charter of Rights, insist that I have my rights to do what I please, and nobody's going to tell me differently. I hope that doesn't happen to Tsuut'ina. If we don't hold our land collectively, as we are doing now, if there's going to be land sale, land leases, we vote on it all together. One person can't say, well, this is my home. This quarter section is where I pasture my cattle. So I'm going to sell it to that rancher over there. Nobody at Tsuut'ina can do that right now. And we'd be sorry if we ever changed ourselves into a municipality and people could sell pieces of the land. We've got the example down south across the border where that happened with a lot of American First Nations, or tribes they call them. I don't think we really want it here, but if we're not careful, we'll go down that slippery slope to individual ownership instead of collective, and then we'll be sorry. So I hope we put this idea of collective rights front and center in our Constitution. Yes, we have a land base. We don't have a land code yet because it's a difficult thing to work out. But we do have a land base we own collectively.
I think that's really important for young kids young people, and honestly adults to know. I keep saying that I've come home, and in New York City, I didn't pay attention to, and this is my default, I didn't pay attention to legislation development. I didn't know what LPTS even did. I think it's always been dinner table discussion at your table in regard to politics, in regard to the Indigenous legislation that you've been involved with, your father has been involved with, and I just didn't pay attention until now. And now that I am paying attention, I think it's really important for me as a young person to get my peers to also pay attention, because I don't think any of us really realize that this Constitution, or at least this is just going off of what has been presented to me in conversations that I've had with people my age and younger, is that they maybe don't understand, for just lack of being communicated with, really how important this Constitution is to our people, and really how important it is to our young people and to 7 generations down the line. To any young people listening, and anyone listening, could you explain to them why this Constitution, why this document is so important to us, from your perspective?
Well, I don't think here at Tsuut'ina that we need to make a detailed Constitution, because we do have already so many laws that might go into a Constitution. Another one is, how do we choose our leaders? That can be important and could be in a Constitution. We might mention it, but we don't really have to detail it, because we have an electoral code, and that tells us how we decided to choose our leader. And you have to realize that these laws that Tsuut'ina has that I'm talking about have all been voted on by the people of Tsuut'ina. It's not something that was pushed onto us. We voted on it. We agreed to it. So we don't have to have a detailed Constitution. It will be more about the principles that we live by. This idea of collective rights, the idea of sharing. Such a good example of that was my mother-in-law, Annie Manywounds. She had that understanding of sharing that people are losing now. There's so much more, what's mine is mine and I'm not going to share it with you, than there used to be when I came here in 1952. So we need to emphasize those important old teachings and try to get people to understand them and live by them. Taking care of children, for instance. Yes, we're going to write a Child and Family Services law or act, whatever you call it. But in the old days, children didn't get left uncared for. Usually it was somebody in the family who cared for a child if the parents couldn't. But if there wasn't family to do it, then somebody in the community did it, because everybody understood that these children, they're our future. If we don't take care of them, the whole group won't have any future. And children were just not neglected in those days. So those are the things we need to emphasize in our Constitution. Those old ways of taking care of each other. We don't have to go into the details because we have them in other laws. For instance, we own our money collectively. Nobody gets the income from the casino individually. We get, what do you call them?
Dividend, PCD?
Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes. But nobody gets an individual share of it. We own that collectively. Or income from any of our operations, like the golf course at Redwood Meadows, or the operation of the gas stop, or the gravel pits, or whatever we have going. We own it together. But we don't have to write it in detail in our Constitution, how we're going to manage this, because we have our Finance and Administration Act, and that sets out how our money is to be taken care of.
Which I think is really important to understand that collective nature and those traditional teachings that I do think, even for myself, we're not living by the principles that our traditions necessarily taught us. And I understand it from maybe a different side. I keep using myself as an example, have been taught about, oh, well, you're an individual and, you know, what you do is for you, etc. But coming home, that's not the case. And maybe this is where my nature comes in. And when I was in America, people would always tell me, you're generous to a fault, which is maybe true, but at the same time, I just didn't understand the nature of hoarding and having and just, you know, mine. I'm one of those people, and maybe because I grew up mainly in your house, in my home, if you want food, go in the fridge, that's where the food is, and you don't have to ask me if you can have, let's say, some hummus and chips. And I've been working from your house during the pandemic pretty much the whole time, so I've raided your fridge a few times and made a few meals along the way. But it's just that nature of sharing and that nature of collective understanding that I just learned it in the home, and then I take it with me everywhere I go. Coming home and working with LPTS, I didn't before, but I have recently read the Indian Act. Heavy read. Didn't have to get on anxiety medication, even though it gave me a ton of anxiety. And I think it's a document that it's a book. It's a whole book of very, very detailed. The language is very heavy, and it basically, up until now, as I understand it, has been the governing authority on Indians. Now, it was never written by us, and it wasn't necessarily written in, as I can see it after reading it, as a way to really benefit us. Rather, it was written as a way to govern us. It's still doing that. Why is the Indian Act so resounding to our people? And that might be the wrong word.
No, that's a fair question, because it was smotheringly over top of First Nations people for generations. When Canada got their original constitution, BNA Act, British North America Act, a couple of small sections in there said that the federal government would be responsible for Indians and lands assigned, or whatever the wording was, to Indians. So once Canada, as a country, tried to figure out how they would carry out that responsibility, well, the logical thing was to pass a law in Parliament that told them how to do it. And away they went with their Indian Act. And it was all-encompassing. It covered everything. You almost couldn't breathe without referring to the Indian Act. Not quite, but almost. People were, to begin with that Indian Act, confined to the reserves they got. The reserves that they got, or that were assigned to them, or that they agreed to under treaty. Now, Ted mentioned the most important difference between our treaties and the Indian Act is that the treaties are between partners. In this case, Canada on one side and a First Nation on the other side, or a group of First Nations. Both of them had to agree what went into the treaty. Now, mind you, because First Nations back in the 17, 18, 1900s didn't write or read English. The colonial partner sure had the upper hand. They wrote into it things that couldn't even be explained to First Nations people because there weren't words in First Nations language for things like cede and surrender the land. And I guess the poor old interpreter, the best he could do was use the word share in the native language, which is a whole lot different from surrender or cede. But it got signed that way. Still, there were things in there that have been in the treaty that have been useful to us, like the medicine chest and the economic development, which was plows and rakes and things in those days. The education, ouch, when you think of residential schools. Mm-hmm. But today, at least, there is education that comes originally from the treaty writings. So the treaty was an agreement by two partners, and it can't be changed unless both partners agree to it. Totally different with the Indian Act. It was imposed by one government on another group of people. And there's nothing we, as First Nations, can do about that Indian Act. We can't revise it, we can't amend it. All we can do is holler about it, go to court about it maybe, but we can't change it. The government keeps amending it, probably nearly every year they put in amendments to their Indian Act.
I ordered my personal copy from Amazon, and I'm keeping it to maybe use as firewood paper. I don't believe in burning books, and I never would. This particular book is just it's very upsetting, and I think it should be because, as you said, it was written for us, but not by us. And I'm finding in Indigenous legislation, reading UNDRIP, and just having you as a resource, so thank you. Language is a huge barrier. We talk about it even. The way we speak is not the way the Canadian government speaks, so it's hard for us to have an understanding. But we need to adapt, we need to evolve. And unfortunately, because Canada is a country and we live in these countries that have governing bodies now established, they have legislators and legislation that is now established. So in writing our Constitution and also thinking about the Indian Act, I think it's, for young people, really important to realize that our oral traditions, our oral teachings, our heritage, those aren't gone and they're not going anywhere. But we do need to play the game, as it would be, play the legislation game. I know that our technical writers work very hard at capturing what needs to be captured in our documents. And I know as you have documents literally sitting in front of you, so that we make sure that we're safeguarded. And so in our Constitution, keeping in mind the Indian Act, for young people out there, and then this is another importance of our Constitution, do you see language as being a barrier? And do you see language as having been a barrier, both traditionally and now, as it pertains to our legislation and our Indigenous legislation development?
What do you mean by being a barrier?
I mean the understanding of language. I know the Gunapa Institute is working very hard. And
Okay, what language are you speaking about?
The English language.
Okay.
Yeah, the English language versus our traditional oral teachings and those understandings. And that, again, we have to play the game. Have you seen it, and do you see it as a barrier to not only our understanding, but to our development? And if it's not a barrier, is it something that we work together, bringing our oral and old teachings while also trying to marry them with the English language, so we're able to finally, instead of having the Indian Act speak for us, speak for ourselves?
Yes, I suppose the English language can be a problem. When you're in high school and some teacher in English says, read The Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare wrote, or Romeo and Juliet, and you go, ouch, this awful old language doesn't make sense. It's still a good idea to work through that darn thing, because a lot of what is legally written in English, even today, is based on that old English that Shakespeare wrote down. So it doesn't hurt to understand some of it, because you need to be able to read legal documents in English. It's a nuisance to have to, but we do. So yes, that English can be a barrier. And I think when the people, let's just look at Treaty 7, when the ancestors who signed Treaty 7 asked for education in English, they understood there's just no getting away with dealing with these people who speak and write English. So our children and our all generations to come are going to have to understand that language and be able to read and write it. The native languages, I hope some of them stay, because even though I don't speak either Cree, where I came from, or Tsuut'ina that I couldn't learn, I think they have a lot of wisdom in them. And out of them can come an understanding of the natural laws that are things that we should emphasize in our Constitution. And getting to that could be a lot of work for somebody else, not me, because I don't have an English language or a native language to count on.
I've always taken the English language very, very... It's been something very important, and I've always held it in high regard. However, the Tsuut'ina Nation language, I think in my pursuit of being understood and being able to rationalize and grasp the English language, I have been taken away, and myself even, from our Tsuut'ina language, and so I find it very hard to understand, and I don't speak it very well. I tried in a language meeting. I was told by the elders that I did a good job. I think they were just being sweet, because I was like, I don't think I did a good job at all. Why is Indigenous legislation development important? Specifically Indigenous.
I'm going to be hard on you, Teddy.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I'm not impressed by the word Indigenous.
Yes. Sorry. I use it because I think I use it mainly because of UNDRIP. I use the word Indigenous because it's been presented to me, and that's always something that I'm a little bit politically not knowing what right word to use. Do I use Native? I don't want to use Indian, because we're not. Do I use Indigenous? And so why is the development of legislation for us?
For First Nations people.
First Nations people, sorry. Almost had it.
Now, here's what's the word when you go off topic? Here are some words that the United Nations uses, Canadian legislation uses, on and on and on, that I wish we would change. They use the words "in the best interests of the child." Wipe that off. It's too open to interpretation. In there, I would put love and respect for the child. That's not so open to interpretation. And I hope I come across Willie Littlechild someday. I haven't seen him in decades. And impress that on him. If he agrees, maybe he'll work on the United Nations and get them to change it. We can hope.
We can hope. Maybe he'll listen to this.
There was one thing I wanted to make clear when we talk about the Indian Act. Those acts that we have, that I talked about, our Citizenship Code, our Residency Bylaw, our Electoral Code, our Finance and Administration Act, all of those things are covered in the Indian Act the way Canada thinks that they should be done for Tsuut'ina. We have decided we want to do it this way. We want our citizenship decided as written in our code. We want our residency decided as written in our residency law, and our electoral code choosing our leaders, and our finance law and our treasury board and all to take care of our money. All of those things were in the Indian Act. But when we wrote our laws, we weren't totally independent. All of them had to be, after they were written, sent off to the Canadian government in Ottawa. And the government had to agree that, yes, those are reasonable laws, go ahead, you can have them. So we're not independent yet. We're a little bit out from under the Indian Act in some areas, but we're not exactly sovereign, even if we like to think we are. We're supposed to be. And business people at Tsuut'ina sometimes still think that they should follow the Indian Act and get a permit for selling gravel, whatever. But I don't think we should. And I learned that from my father decades ago. He was a farmer, so he sold grain, he sold cattle. And if you wanted to sell a cow, the way the Indian Act is written, or a steer, whatever, first you went to the Indian agent and you got a permit to sell your cow. Or you wanted to sell a load of grain. First you went to the Indian agent and you got a permit to sell your load of grain. And on and on and on it went. It was a smothering law, that Indian Act. But somehow my father, who was a very persuasive talker, managed to persuade the people off the reserve that he was dealing with, that he wanted to sell his produce to. Well, it's just too hard for me to go the 6 miles on my wagon to get a permit to bring this cow to sell. Couldn't you just take it? And for some reason, the people he was dealing with agreed, and he stopped getting permits to sell his produce. And he carried on for that, like that, for as long as he farmed, which was decades. And nobody in Indian, not Indian, but the government people who were around the Indian agent, that was what I wanted. The Indian agent never seemed to bother about it. It just worked that way. Now, when I got to Tsuut'ina, I can remember in the 50s and 60s, people were still getting permits to sell any of their resources or any of the things they produced. And it's still happening. But if some people could do it, why can't Native people, First Nations people, just do it? If there aren't going to be any terrible consequences, and it's a nuisance getting permits, do it.
Maybe I'm wrong here, but is that an example of us practicing our sovereignty?
I think so.
That's something that I've spoken to heavily about with people in the department, were these small practices of our sovereignty and what that looks like. I didn't know that about great-grandpa, but I also didn't know he farmed for decades. I probably did in the back of my head, but I've always known him as a politician, I think, because that's what we talk about mainly. I can see a photo of him and my great-grandmother looking at me right now, and he's like, "You should know that I was a farmer. Sorry." Sort of closing up the interview, and this is a moment where I wanted to give you a chance to speak to our young listeners and to any of our listeners, maybe even Willie Littlechild, because I'm not sure, with this podcast, as you know, I've been doing it in your home with me, a computer, and Andrew is my sound engineer, who's not a sound engineer, but he's been doing a great job, and I'm thankful to have him. Is there something that you would like to say to the citizens of Tsuut'ina Nation, to the young people, in regards to what we've been talking about, the Constitution, the Indian Act, and First Nations legislation development?
As soon as, to young people, as soon as you're old enough, 12, 13, 14, be aware that there's still this smothering Indian Act, but at the same time, we don't want it just dropped and in its place, First Nations can own their land just like municipalities do and sell it off, and that's the end. So while we may be upset with all these rules in the Indian Act, we have to be careful that we don't dump it for something worse. Something else that, if we don't individually pay attention to, we need to have somewhere in our government organization somebody who always is paying attention to what these legal beagles, these hundreds of lawyers that the government employs, are writing either as laws, new ones, or amendments to laws presently on the books. Because if we don't know what they're saying, and it's a lot of laws that impact First Nations, not just the Indian Act, but there are a lot of laws out there that impact us. And especially right now, after the Kamloops discovery, governments, whether they're the Liberals in power, the Conservatives in opposition, NDP saying their thing, they're all being sympathetic to First Nations right now. But somewhere in the bowels of government are all these lawyers, and I honestly don't think they've changed, even though the people have changed. This group of bureaucrats who do the writing of legislation for the Canadian government, they haven't changed yet. Somewhere in the back of their minds, their collective minds, they're still thinking of ways to finally get rid of Indians in the country. Not to kill them off, but just to change them into ordinary Canadian citizens. Mm-hmm. And we have to watch and always be aware that, oops, we better have something in our back pockets that will answer these things. Actually, that's how these laws that I mentioned to begin with mostly came about. Our citizenship code came about because in the mid-80s, the federal government was going to change what was written in the Indian Act about membership in First Nations bands, they called them then. Not nations, but bands. But they gave First Nations the opportunity to write their own citizenship codes if they wanted to. Now, they had to be written so that the government could approve of them. Tsuut'ina's was, and I understand all the First Nations in Treaty 7 have their own membership codes that the people voted on and passed, and that all-seeing government in Ottawa agreed to. But that's not true for all the First Nations across the country. There are lots of them that still don't have a citizenship code, either because they didn't write one in the first place or because they wrote something that the Canadian government didn't agree with, so it never got passed. So what these people are writing about in their laws that affect us, and try to be prepared to have an answer that will protect Tsuut'ina in this case.
It's important.
Maybe something like that should be written into our Constitution.
And thankfully, our Constitution, for all our listeners out there, is still in draft. You have agency and every right to, as a Tsuut'ina Nation citizen, get involved and read it and ask questions. Give us your input through LPTS. It is not yet passed, it's not yet been enacted, but we want to make sure that all of our citizens, or our eligible electorate, are engaged and knowledgeable. They do have agency, that we are all, we talked about the collective, that we're all collectively recognized. Because I think it's really important, and I think it will, it's going to impact you, both hopefully for the good. I can always say there's a good and a bad in everything in the future. And like I said, I think it was my own bankruptcy that I just didn't get involved, and I didn't think I was allowed to. This is all on me. I absolutely was, and I should have been. And yeah, I think that collective and that collective importance and that ideology is carried through in the future. And is there, closing off our interview, is there anything you would like to say to the listeners?
Stay strong. Keep up the good fight. Tsuut'ina's still here.
And we are still here. Thank you so much, Grandma. Thank you so much. I feel strange calling you Muriel, but thank you so much, Grandma Muriel. Thank you for listening to the We Are Here podcast. I have been your host, Teddy Manywounds. We Are Here is presented by Legislative Procedures and Technical Services under the governance portfolio of Tsuut'ina Nation. Director William Bigplume, Executive Director Jordan Bigplume. Show direction and production, William Bigplume, Teddy Manywounds, and Marcy McGinnis Two Guns. Sound design and sound editing, Andrew David Barron. Archive and research development, William Bigcrow, Gilbert Crowchild, and Marcy McGinnis Two Guns. Script research and technical development, Marcy McGinnis Two Guns, Cree Bigplume, and Brittany McGinnis Two Guns. Traditional Protocol Advisory, Gilbert Crowchild. A special thank you to the Tsuut'ina Nation Treaty Initiatives Program, the Tsuut'ina Nation Communications Department, and last but not least, Chief and Counsel. Thank you for listening. See you, Gus.